Professor Stalnaker is a professor of religious studies who studies ethics, political theory, and philosophy of religion, with serious attention paid to both Chinese and Western theories and practices. His first book was called Overcoming Our Evil, examining and comparing ideas of personal formation in the work of Xunzi and St. Augustine. His second book was called Mastery, Dependence, and the Ethics of Authority, which really examining Confucian social thought in relation to contemporary ethical and political theory. And his next project is a kind of comparative moral theory of Zhuangzi, a Taoist philosopher, and Augustine. And his paper today is entitled Two Contemporary Approaches to Confucian Religious Humanism. I just want to say that there is a long-standing tradition of treating Confucianism as mere humanism, as secular humanism, rather than religious humanism. And I'm very excited that Aaron is offering a really wonderfully analytical account of this tension, of the kind of classification of Confucian humanism as either secular or religious through his analysis of two important Confucian intellectuals in the 20th century. One more thing I wish to say is that the concept of religion is new in China. It was a loan word from the Japanese in the late 19th century. It was first used in fact, Japanese treaties with the West. But it doesn't mean religion as a lived experience, as theology, as culture, did not exist in China. So the first time I gave a lecture here at Oxford, I in fact gave a talk to the Faculty of Classics. I was invited by scholars of Roman religion. In fact, I was invited by Teresa Morgan, a scholar of early Christianity, who recognized that to set religion apart as a separate category is not something universally experienced, practiced in the past as well, actually, as in the present. So one could argue that the Chinese did not think of religion as a separate thing really until the 20th century. And that is the context of Aaron's paper.
Well, let's go. So in this paper, I present two snapshots of contemporary Confucian humanism. One presented as religious and one eschewing that label. Humanism, or its modern Chinese equivalents, it's usually 人道主义, the doctrine of the human way, if you were going to try to translate literally, is very much a living and productive category of thought for contemporary Chinese intellectuals. It has deep and resonant emotional roots, cultural roots in Chinese traditions, and it's thus an excellent kind of bridge concept between Western and Chinese thinking and practice. It's good thus for academic study, but also if someone were an activist or a political policymaker and you were trying to interact productively with people in Chinese cultural sphere. Now I focus here on two main figures, Du Weiming and Li Zehou. While these men are plausible and common choices as major, even preeminent Confucian intellectuals of the 20th and 21st centuries, there are lots of other people I could have picked. It's hard to overstate just how much of an intellectual efflorescence there's been in the last 150 years of Chinese culture, and especially since the 1980s with the economic rise of Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the People's Republic of China. They have started putting vast expenditures towards building up their universities and research and education, including spending real money on the humanities, or what we would consider the humanities. Now, the turbulent recent history of these cities and states, as well as the broader ongoing Chinese diaspora, really necessitates some brief remarks on the divergences between these contexts. And they'll play out, I think you'll see, in my two figures. And it especially relates to the history of Confucianism, which is the standard translation for the Ru tradition in China. So both before and after the fall of the last imperial Chinese dynasty in 1911, Chinese thinkers struggled with how to relate to militarily and politically, economically powerful Western powers with their distinctive ideas and their threatening, aggressive self-confidence, and that led to repeated humiliations for the Chinese state. So new neologisms were coined, as Anna was just telling us, or borrowed from slightly earlier Japanese coinages to name, understand, and discuss a bunch of novel ideas like religion, philosophy, liberalism, or Marxism. All that stuff was new. Now, one key moment was the new culture movement in the 1910s and 20s, and this attacked traditional Chinese culture as backward, and that included Confucianism. So after a spectacularly brutal sequence of wars to repel Japanese invaders and colonists, and then contend over whether the Chinese Communist Party or the Nationalist Party would rule China, the Communists won a decisive victory in 1949, and the Nationalists fled to Taiwan, which they conquered and held as their new base. Now, within the PRC, Chinese Marxism was the guiding philosophy for the new state. They attacked traditional culture with increasing ferocity, culminating in the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution of 1966 to 76. So in that period, temples were ransacked and destroyed. Intellectuals and other enemies of the revolution were humiliated, tortured, and killed. It was quite rough. Now, while the nationalists ruled with impressive brutality in Taiwan, there was no similar rebellion against traditional Chinese culture. And in fact, to the contrary, they tried to justify their young regime in relation to traditional Chinese culture and made its study mandatory for young Taiwanese. Similarly, Hong Kong and Singapore escaped the excesses of the Great Leap Forward. I mean, basically Maoist romantic insanity. And Singapore leaned heavily on its own version of Confucianism as its guiding philosophy of government. Now, Confucianism was a central topic in debates about the Chinese past and stimulated many and various discontents as well as defenses across the Chinese cultural world and in the West. Now, as noted, many attacks on Confucian thought, culture, and practice were mounted by reformers, especially in the PRC. Similarly, but distinctly, Western thinkers went from an initially very positive reaction to Chinese thought, and in particular Confucianism during the early Enlightenment. So thinkers like Voltaire thought that Confucianism was the natural religion par excellence and thought it was just great. Leibniz loved the Chinese. But with romanticism and the backlash to these views grew, and then as Western cultural self-confidence and power grew to its apex and cultural hubris in Europe sort of reached its maximum, you can see the views change dramatically in the views of thinkers like Hegel, who don't have much good to say about the Chinese or Confucianism. But predictably, there was a counter-movement. Taiwanese thinkers especially led the charge, like Mo Zhongshan, and they created what has come to be called New Confucianism as a sequence of ripostes, primarily to all the Chinese critics, but also to this Western chauvinism that I've discussed. Now, given his personal history and commitments, Du Weiming presents himself self-consciously as a new Confucian, continuing that tradition, whereas Li Zehou does not. He presents himself as a Confucian Marxist and a world philosopher. Now, just a few remarks about the Chinese intellectual context. The disciplinary arrangements of Chinese scholars who study Confucianism, Confucian, Taoist, and Buddhist thought are partitioned somewhat differently than here in the West. The PRC research universities commonly tend to have departments of philosophy, which is 哲学 in Chinese, Marxism, and national studies, which is most akin to the Western field of classics, accompanied by a governmental commitment to boosting the prestige of classical Chinese culture as they construe it. Religious studies is rare, but it does exist. And the study of Confucianism is mostly going on in philosophy and national studies departments. Now in Taiwan and Singapore, philosophy is the primary home for studies of Confucianism, and there aren't any Marxism departments. Now, for present purposes, one key aspect of this different intellectual context that needs to be highlighted is the limited and potentially misleading distinction between the secular and the religious, which, as Anna said, is an import from the West and then gets repurposed in various ways within China. So in brief, to summarize a ton of scholarship, contemporary scholars of China, influenced by Talal Asad and others, see the religious-secular distinction primarily, but not exclusively, as a Western cultural import that continues to be used by the Chinese state to facilitate nation building according to the ends sought by the Chinese Communist Party. And I'll say CCP from here on out. And they do this via increasingly granular social regulation and policing. For example, Vincent Gosser and David Palmer argue that modern Chinese governments from the late Qing dynasty through the present PRC have used the imported term zongjiao, religion, to engage in a secularizing project from their point of view. This project separates potentially tolerable rational religion, these are the 5 official traditions of Buddhism, Taoism, Islam, Catholicism, and Protestantism. Those are the 5 religions. And from superstition, very bad, thus consigning the vast body of Chinese folk religion, which is a huge amount of practice and lived religion, to a suspect category that the party basically aims to eradicate. Even worse and more suspicious are evangelical house churches, which are viewed as rebellious and a threat to the regime. Mayfair Yang and Peter van der Veer highlight the Chinese state's absolutism, in which all spiritual authority is brought under the control and direction of the CCP, aiming to break local and alternative power networks and centers. Anna Sun examines the struggles of the PRC to categorize Confucianism. If it were classed as a religion, it would need to be regulated. But if it were classed as a philosophy, it could be promoted as a valuable part of China's national heritage. And that latter strategy has effectively won out in today's PRC, but with the Confucianism so celebrated being distinctly what the regime wants. So they are construing the parts they like, the more authoritarian elements, as central and just forgetting all the rest conveniently. So religion is thus a rather suspect category to most Chinese thinkers. It's alarmingly close to superstition, not nearly as prestigious as philosophy. They picked up that bit, and thereby incurring even more attentive government oversight than national study or philosophy. Now, I will just skip the contrast terms, which in the interest of time, but the thing to note here is the relative dearth of voices in the PRC in particular advocating for religious perspectives in public discussion and the predominance of openly anti-religious policy over anything resembling neutrality between competing conceptions of the good. So, thus endeth the intro. And I welcome questions about all this. A lot of this is going to be summaries. So I'm just trying to introduce a lot of material to you, and hopefully it will be interesting. So our first figure, we'll do Du and then Li, and then I'll close with some brief concluding remarks at the end. So Du Weiming was born in Kunming in southwest China, and he fled with his family to Taiwan with the nationalists. So he was educated as a child and young man in Taiwanese schools, and he studied with Mo Zhongshan and other new Confucians like Xu Fuguan in Taiwan. He became absolutely fascinated by Confucianism through this educational process and wanted to devote himself to it. He got his PhD at Harvard, so was given a scholarship and came to Harvard, and then has had a quite illustrious career in American academia, moving from Berkeley to Princeton and then back to Harvard, and all the while quite involved in the development of religious studies as a field in America, distinct from theology and philosophy, but related. He ended up retiring in 2008 and moved back to a chair in philosophy at Peking University, Beida, which he still holds. But he's quite old now, but still alive. Now, From his collegiate studies onward, Du has been passionately committed to the pursuit of dialogue among civilizations. He sees this sort of dialogue as an intrinsically valuable humanistic practice of mutual learning that is in important ways continuous with the learning for oneself, i.e. for personal growth rather than professional goals or economic advancement, that is such an important part of Confucianism. Du writes, dialogue is first and foremost about one's own learning and self-reflection, a constant recalibration of the limitations of one's own worldview. This is the only stable mutual foundation for dialogical exchange among equals, end quote. In the American context that he came to inhabit, Du pursued this quest in conjunction with sustained efforts to establish and develop religious studies as an interdisciplinary field. Now, the ultimate telos of this civilizational dialogue is the construction of what Du has lately come to call spiritual humanism. He writes the following in 2003. Whether one looks east or west, the study of benevolence, a central Chinese Confucian virtue, or more directly, the path of learning to be human, is an integral part of classical education. As we emerge from a century of extreme barbarism, such education faces some deeply meaningful challenges. Even if we can all now accept human dignity as an abstract universal value, we still have to embody this principle in our treatment of individual people. This requires the cultivation of a capacity to see such encounters as opportunities rather than threats. True dialogue requires the creation of a living partnership with others. Only thus can any sense of common cause be actively established. Through dialogue amongst civilizations, we not only uncover wisdom from our own traditions, the entire accumulated stock of the human community is opened up to us. While Du wishes to preserve the best elements of the Enlightenment, he does think the religious traditions of humanity are of immense value, tremendous contemporary value, and should be attended to carefully so that human beings can truly flourish. To this end, Du self-consciously and repeatedly presents Confucianism as a religious tradition, and he actively contributed to building up religious studies at places like Harvard and Berkeley as a rigorous but still humane and humanistic study of religion. And he thought this was a particularly necessary task in his era as a way to respond to Samuel Huntington's thesis about the conflict among civilizations, notably Islamic, Chinese, and the West. So he thought he really needed to speak to that. So more specifically, Du presents Confucianism as a form of religious humanism well suited to participate in a worldwide dialogue of civilizations due to its distinctive form of religiosity and its ethical and religious depths. So he does acknowledge past failings of Confucianism, in particular its patriarchalism and its co-optation as in systems of authoritarian domination. But he presents the Confucian Tao as something like an ultimate concern in the Tillich sense. And he himself acts as something like a Confucian Taologian, trying to represent the tradition as he understands it, sort of distilling it to its essence as he understands it. And this is coming out of a place of deeper scholarship than he sometimes gets credit for, and also profound personal commitment. Now, like other new Confucians, Du distinguishes three epochs in the history of Confucianism. The classical period, this is when Confucius and Mengzi and Xunzi happen, and the Book of Rites. Then the second epoch is Neo-Confucianism. It's often called the Song and Ming thinkers, Juxi and Wang Yongming. And then the present day New Confucianism, which he is a part of. Now, just to summarize a bit, Wang Yongming is a later critic of Juxi. Juxi rejiggered the whole tradition, raising up the so-called four books, which were the Analects of Confucius, the Mencius or Mengzi, and then two chapters of the Li Ji, the Great Learning, and usually the Zhongyong, called the Doctrine of the Mean usually, but in Du's hands, centrality and commonality. And so I will, in what follows, talk about his reading of that text. So the way to think about this is that Du is piggybacking on Wang Yongming. He sees the tradition as himself continuing Wang's continuation of Mengzi's thought. So we could call this the inward turn of Ming Dynasty Confucian religiosity. So that inward subjectivity is really quite central to the whole process, and self-cultivation is the essential thing. All right. So these are the four main themes of Du's book about the Zhongyong, centrality and commonality. I'll go through each of them in turn. Now, the one thing to note before I do this, his approach is deeply influenced by American religious studies. And he draws noticeably on existentially interested hermeneutic theories of textual interpretation as well as comparative religion theory. So this is his sort of general account of his view. The human way is therefore neither theocentric nor anthropocentric. Rather, it points to the mutuality of heaven and man. It necessitates a transcendent anchorage for the existence of man and an imminent confirmation of the course of heaven. Underlying this approach is what Eliade calls anthropo-cosmic unity, so that the human and the cosmic are all together, so that the human way grows out of the natural or heavenly way. Now, I'm going to have to just start summarizing in the interest of time, I think. The profound person is the Du's translation of Junzi, which was in Victorian times translated as gentleman, means something like the noble person or noble man. It was definitely coded male. But he wants to emphasize the spiritual depths of the profound person and open it up to everyone. So this person seeks to enact the ultimate meaning of life in ordinary human existence. So day-to-day activity, interactions with others, especially family members, and deepening their inner strength through a process of study, practice, and care for others. And it doesn't really depend on talent. It just depends on sustained effort and work. This is, the ultimate goal there is the complete realization of the unity of humanity and heaven via a process of ever-deepening subjectivity. Now, the one thing to note here is this sounds very individualistic, but Du repeatedly harps on the self not as the sort of atomic individual of modern Western political theory, but instead the self is a center of relationships. There are famously, the Mengzi lists the 5 relationships that define who we are, and there are many others, but our relationality to others is absolutely essential to who we are. We cannot know who we are, learn to be human, except in relationship to others. So this is a Confucian theme that resonated strongly with the practitioners panel from yesterday, I would say. Now, that brings us to the second main theme for Du, which is the fiduciary community. Interestingly, this is where he discusses virtues in terms of community life rather than in personal cultivation. He starts with filial piety or filial reverence, the unusual Chinese virtue of respect for your parents above all. This grows into ritual, which is another distinctive Confucian virtue, where it's about ritualized respect and care for other people. And he thinks this is essentially a marker of the ideal society, that it will be marked by sort of ritualized, respectful, and caring interactions and mutual trust that grows out of this. The virtues start with humanity, which is his translation of ren, often translated as benevolence or goodness, depending on the text. And that, from his point of view, is the root of all the virtues for Confucianism. So other things like courage or wisdom grow out of this. It also, humanity, this virtue, is also the guide to political life, according to Du. Government should be understood, following a passage in the Analects, as rectification. And thus, the art of government can be taken as an extension of moral education. Thus, in the Confucian view, Du discerns in the Zhongyong, personal cultivation teaches one how to govern others at all levels of society, from family to state and empire. Now, this is a highly integrated vision of politics. It's also, from my point of view, extremely idealistic. He's trying to articulate the norm, the ideal that we can strive for. And this is something that is quite noticeable in Confucian culture, is a real sense of the possible instantiation on earth of a more or less perfect society, even if it's hard and rare. Now, Du highlights some of the distinctive features of his version of Confucianism in this part, the moral metaphysics. And this is where the focus on Zhongyong really is important, because here he contends that for Confucians, moral ideas are much more than social norms, and the ultimate manifestation of morality transcends social ethics and reaches its ultimacy in the unity of heaven and man. So the claim here is that, quote, ultimate reality is perceivable and realizable in the moral life of every person because human nature is potentially a genuine manifestation of that reality. Human beings, by nature, share the reality of heaven, which is the ultimate religious object here. Through self-cultivation, we realize that ideal and we become co-creators of the world with heaven. Now, the key term here is cheng, often translated as sincerity, but in Du's hands, something more like authenticity or truth, being true to yourself, your true nature manifesting. And this is not just of humans, but of the cosmos. So he views the entire cosmos as a process of creative generation of life, life begetting life, and human beings are part of this ongoing process. This is Confucian religiousness, according to Du. Selfhood as creative self-transformation and creative world building. Okay, so here's a quote. Being religious in the Confucian perspective, informed by sacred texts such as Zhongyong, means being engaged in the process of learning to be fully human. We can define the Confucian way of being religious as ultimate self-transformation, as a communal act, and as a faithful dialogical response to the transcendent. So this is clearly in Du's terms, and in my own too, a form of religious humanism. He hastens to qualify the cosmic orientation here as immanence with a transcendent dimension, rather than some radically transcendent form of worshiping a divine object. Now, obviously one could register all sorts of historical or philosophical objections to various elements of Du's views or his construal of the tradition, but I'm just here trying to lay it out so you can see this one quite widely influential version of Confucianism in the present day. And I welcome questions, obviously, at the end. Okay, on to Li Zehou. So Li grew up in the PRC, and specifically in Hunan, which is Mao's home province, so the hotbed of Chinese communism, and he seems to have been a zealous Marxist from an early age. But as happens in the PRC, you can run afoul of the authorities if you just happen to be unlucky or anything. So he was educated in Hunanese schools and then ended up at Beijing University for his graduate training, and then ascended immediately to the heights of Chinese academia. And was involved, his home field originally was aesthetics, the philosophy of beauty, and was involved in debates in the 50s about Marxist aesthetics. Got caught up in the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, and when he was sent down to the countryside to learn from the peasants, he was reading and writing a book about Kant at night underneath his bed. He returns to Beijing in 1979, publishes the book on Kant, and then publishes a sequence of books on aesthetics and various other things, becomes an academic superstar, a real celebrity in China, and it's part of the culture fever of the 80s as people try to figure out how to go on after all the Maoist excesses. He was on the right side of history, but the wrong side of the party in 1989. So when the Tiananmen uprising arose, he was on the side of the students, and then that made all of his works unacceptable to the state. He hung on for a few years and then decided to leave. So he said, he published a piece called Farewell to Revolution and left in 1992 and moved to Boulder, Colorado. So he was saved by American academics and then ended up, so he went from basically the pinnacle of Chinese cultural life to teaching undergrads at UC Boulder Intro to Chinese Civilization. He kept on publishing though. The man is extremely productive. And he produced a number of things, and many of his works have now been translated. Well, a noticeable number of them, there are quite a lot more, have been translated into English, so he is available. Now, in contrast to Du, Li Zehou never identified as a new Confucian, and as we will see, he is critical of some key moves that Du makes. He, as a sui generis philosopher with broad interests, and he became increasingly interested in ethics and political theory as he got older. Li might perhaps best be thought of as a world philosopher. Now, despite his astounding breadth, he can profitably be understood as focusing on articulating an overarching philosophy of the human being, what he called an anthropo-historical ontology, and which we might consider, with Robert Carleo, an important form of humanism with a strong emphasis on ethics. Now, more specifically, his overall view is a Marxian reinterpretation of Kantian philosophy. Supplemented and amended by several themes and ideas from Confucian thought. Now, it can be challenging for Westerners more steeped on Hegel's critique of Kant to wrap their mind around what he's doing. His ideas are sometimes speculative, they're distinctive, there's a lot of unusual nomenclature here. Now, as Andrew Lambert has insightfully argued, Li's work in the 1980s was grappling with three major, often conflicting issues that affected Chinese intellectuals trying to chart a way forward after Mao's excesses. Quote, the place of tradition, especially Confucian thought in 20th century China. Second, the role of Western learning and culture. And third, the future of a Marxism with Chinese characteristics. So he's trying to somehow synthesize those things into something new and livable for people. So Li aims to do this by providing a Marxian reinterpretation of Kant's philosophy. He trespasses on central elements of Kantian philosophical pretensions, like the transcendental analytic, and it's quite creative and productive. He articulates a new version of the human that is alert to history and culture, while being shorn of hard Maoist voluntarism, unbelievable historical teleology, and pseudo-scientific determinism, as well as delusional beliefs about Chinese peasants as the avatars of revolution. He was, to the consternation of the authorities, not doctrinaire nor loyal to the party or the state in his use of Marxist ideas. And if anything, he was a partisan of the early Marx to attack later Marxist ideas as it became more doctrinaire. Now, Kantian thought provides him a way to accent what is uniquely human about human beings, our rational moral agency, as he understands it. And both Marxian and Kantian ideas are useful to him as he interprets some key themes, reinterprets Confucian themes, such as the unity of heaven and man and the virtue of humaneness. And also Confucian thought provides a great way to avoid the rationalist and individualist excesses of some Western thought, including Kant. The result is a rather striking fusion, which I'm going to try to lay the main lines of out for you. This is the anthropo-historical ontology of the human. 人类学历史本体论. All right. So he provides a genealogy of the human that's worthy of any 19th century, or 18th century, pardon me, Enlightenment intellectual, but with a more acute sense of cultural variations between civilizations that are not reducible to stages of development, even though he still thinks that way. Now, logically speaking, his theory begins with an analysis of human nature. He accepts that we are, biologically speaking, animals, but we are also distinctively human. We are tool users, we have subjectivity, or as he will want to say, subjectality. I'll say more in a moment. And our capacity for practice and building things will transform ourselves and our environment in many ways. These capacities together explain our capacity to produce and propagate cultural psychological formations, which are shared within social groups. These develop and accumulate via a process he calls sedimentation, through which social reason becomes sedimented in sensible perceptions as social practice is internalized in our subjective consciousness. These are visible both in the psychology of individuals and in the objective patterns of culture and interaction between group members in a way that's rather reminiscent, if you've read him, of Pierre Bourdieu's concept of the habitus. Although he seems not to have heard of Bourdieu before then. Now, in Li's telling, ancient Chinese civilization was shamanistic. So starting from the Shang dynasty in the 1600 to 1045 BCE, and it was the culmination of this arrangement where the ruler was the chief shaman, and they were propitiating the high god Di. So the ecstatic and magical practices of the early shamans were gradually and decisively shifted into more objective written accounts of the scribe or historian, and the ritual order of practices governing social life of all kinds. Over time, the religious life of the shaman king, the religious charisma of the shaman king, is gradually transmuted into the virtue of good leaders in the Zhou dynasty. So the really decisive shift here is with the Zhou, where you stop worrying about placating the capricious deity D through magical ceremonies and instead relate to the divine entity Tian, who is a much more steady presence as the heavens twirl in order. Now, the key thing here in Li's genealogy is Confucius and Confucianism as it develops. So the Duke of Zhou gave ritual its political form, but Confucius saves it from being this empty system of social control by, in effect, psychologizing ritual. So Confucian ritual on Li's account is based on the ontological foundation of human bloodlines and kinship feeling, so that our own emotional tendencies are the basis. But it's initiated externally as a set of traditional practices to be followed. This is, in effect, he says, a primitive humanism that resists cruelty and exploitation while cultivating social harmony via regulated interpersonal relationships, the development of personal character, and an emphasis on pragmatic rationality. This is, he says, a one worldview in contrast to two worldviews, like Platonism and Abrahamic religions, that insist that there is a transcendental realm of forms or God that gives meaning to the world of human beings. And he wants to make a number of broad contrasts here between an emphasis on intellectual contemplation versus more bodily practice. He is skeptical of two worldviews that relativize the significance of human relationships as worldly, including those in the family, from his point of view. By contrast, Confucian contributions to Chinese cultural psychological formations stress that meaning and value are to be found in the concrete, historical, and social human world. This is an optimistic vision, Li argues, and reflects what he characterizes as the long-standing Chinese culture of delight or pleasure in everyday life, relationships, and activities. And this is why aesthetics is such an important topic, he thinks, in Chinese civilization and in Chinese philosophy. Now, there's a lot we could say about this, but I just want to highlight two things. First, Li is notably critical of the Song and Ming Neo-Confucians, like Zhu Xi and Wang Yangming, who he thinks overemphasized inner subjective experience at the expense of social order and communal life, as well as practical affairs of government and economics. And he thinks these were more properly given their due weight by early Confucians like Confucius or Mengzi or Xunzi. And he also thinks that later Neo-Confucians injected Buddhist asceticism into the tradition in a way that messed it up. So he's critical of Du and people like him, the Neo-Confucians, and he thinks they've gone wrong. Now, secondly, Li in many respects rehabilitates the early Confucian Xunzi, who I wrote about in my first book. And Xunzi is right, Li argues, to see empirical human nature as chaotic and amoral, but with distinctively human capacity to form social groups, which is achieved through artificial, effortful creation of cultural and ritual regulations. We manage our material desires, we cultivate them into increasingly elaborate and beautiful forms. And that's the right view, he thinks. Okay, I'm going to keep summarizing. Li's meta-theory of human ethics in general grows out of this. So sedimentation is part of his aesthetic theory. He's trying to sort of mediate between object-centered and subject-centered accounts of beauty. He rejects a Maoist aesthetics of class struggle that art has to contribute to the revolution. And he wants to make room for subjective experience and pleasure and delight and freedom even within Marxism. So the root of beauty, he says, is humanized nature. This is where human projects and purposes interact with the natural world. We use tools to build things, make stuff. And that means that paradigmatic examples of beauty are not only art objects like paintings, but also things like suspension bridges and bullet trains, where we have interacted with reality in such a way that we can make something that's beautiful, but also useful for us. So humanized nature, we are in effect, civilization is making the world beautiful when done properly. Now, the distinctively human capacity to develop and use tools is the root of all this. We scaffold ourselves into all sorts of things. So I'm not going to read this whole quote, but this is the sort of two halves of what I was earlier referring to as his version of the habitus idea. So you have the external material aspect based on what he calls the techno-social structure. So all of the developed structure of civilization, but on the other side is the psychological aspect of this that internalizes, condenses, and sediments in intelligence, the will, and aesthetic feeling. That's the cultural psychological structure. And that's where our morality, our sense of beauty comes from. We feel it internally like a moral law, a la Kant, right? So it stands in judgment within us, but it is in fact a historical product, produced differently over time based on, so you can see this sort of Marxist rereading of Kant here. So that's the overarching view. Now, one of his distinctive ideas is subjectality. So there are in fact two different Chinese words that are usually translated as subjectivity, jutising, which is more common, but Li says that juguanxing, sort of the self-viewing nature, is rather more like what we mean by subjectivity. So he wants to say that jutising is an ontological concept. This is how we are as beings, rather than an epistemological one like subjectivity at the root of German idealism. So he wants to say that tools and technology accumulate into a suprabiological body. This is the rooms we're in, the university we're a part of, all the phones in our pocket, all this stuff. And we, in effect, scaffold ourselves through historical practices into new forms of life. So those of you who've read the early Marx will recognize all of this. So this is how he's doing it, right? So as Li summarizes his own position, in short, that which seems to be transcendental to an individual is actually sedimentation, which has been historically acquired through the collective experience of humankind. This is what a theory of anthropo-historical ontology intends by the expression, the empirical turns into the transcendental a priori, history builds up rationality or reason, psychology grows into substance. So our sense of the moral necessities of things will change over time if you look historically at different periods. Now, Li also insists on the possibility and critical importance of human freedom, despite his rereading of Kant. Indeed, this is arguably the whole point of turning to Kant in the first place for him, to escape the Marxist and Maoist dogmas about social and historical forces determining consciousness and human moralities in favor of a more nuanced view of human history and social forces conditioning and shaping human consciousness, agency, and emotional dispositions. All right. 5 more minutes. As should now be apparent, summarizing Li Zehou is rather like trying to summarize Hegel. There's a lot going on. It's this huge systematic edifice. There's interesting and very debatable points all the way through, and a lot of interesting insights into human society. But I have left out much that is of considerable interest. He has extended engagements with people like Rawls and Michael Sandel, as well as other contemporary philosophers. So this is the 30,000-foot overview. I also, in the written version, have a lengthy quote where he attacks efforts to present Confucianism as a religion and explains what's wrong with that. But we're just going to leave that to the side. So we can see that Li considers Confucianism to be primarily focused on the human and what is required for humans to lead good, humane lives. He's also convinced of the contemporary global relevance of Confucian ideas and practices within and beyond China, including, one would presume, to broad-minded discussions of humanism, such as the one we're engaged in. All right, to very briefly wrap up. Li Zehou and Weiming present two contrasting accounts of Chinese civilization and Confucian tradition. Despite their differences of emphasis, they still share many themes in common, and both stress the Confucian focus on human beings and an ethical worldview and ethos centered on cultivating and enacting humaneness as both individual virtue and mode of social life. I thus strongly agree with Slava when she argues that Confucianism is pertinent to contemporary discussions of humanism because of its strong focus on human being and becoming, its distinctive cosmologies, its uneasy relationship to the religion-secular distinction, and, quote, the ethical tradition of critique it provokes. Humanism is a very plausible bridge between Western and Chinese cultures for the purposes of dialogue and mutual learning on ethical and political themes, as well as philosophical and religious ones. Nevertheless, that fact does nothing to address the increasingly pervasive and effective control the CCP exerts over Chinese society and even beyond its borders on some Chinese nationals. It is sad but instructive that Li Zehou, despite being a committed Marxist, was driven out for his free-thinking ways. Rosy tendencies to essentialize and romanticize China, and especially the PRC government, as Confucian do not help matters, and are in fact false to the Confucian obligation of intellectuals to protest abuses of power. Cross-cultural respect, what I've called global neighborliness, and for those who believe in it, Christian love, all demand much more of us than that. So, thank you very much.